Jesus Maranatha.
I do have a spiritual talk I want to give today, and I'm going into that now. This is a little bit of an experiment because, if I can say so, the stuff is pretty far out there in some ways, deeply spiritual, dare I say. So I'm just going to shoot. Okay, it's basically all about divine providence. I talk about divine providence a lot. I think divine providence is actually the key to everything. Believing in divine providence is the key to absolutely pretty much everything. The only way, well, to say it's the only way to live sanely is to suggest that its value is because you feel good or you don't get upset. But it's more than that. It's the only way to live in a way genuinely in sync with God, dancing properly with God, so to speak, letting him lead. And it's the only way to actually live in the divine will. I'm not using that in a particular sense referring to Luisa Picaretta, but just even Dolindo talked a lot about the divine will. It's the only way to live in the divine will. And it's the only way actually to be continually pleasing to God. So it's super important. And there are a lot of problems with really believing in divine providence. And that's why I want to talk about what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I'm going to recount a prayer experience that a close friend of mine had, which is really neat. And I believe it not only because I believe my friend, but because it is very similar to the experience that I had that converted me, my first mystical experience that converted me from being an atheist. And it's the following. This person found, I'm going to use I guess I'll use a masculine pronoun. No, I'll use a feminine pronoun, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a woman, but I have to choose. This person found herself in some sense, in the presence of God after death. And she saw that when you do find yourself in the presence of God after death, for the judgment, you will realize, she realized, that she had absolutely nothing to reproach God for. In other words, that absolutely everything that had ever happened to her had been absolutely perfect. There was nothing that she could, in hindsight, sort of in the presence of God, think or wish that God had done any differently. That everything was perfect. There was nothing that she could complain to God about whatsoever in everything that happened to her. It's essentially the same as the experience that I had in my first experience of God. Now, I say that because, of course, if you're going to accept divine providence, everyone has a lot of things happen to them that they think are really bad at the time, like dying of cancer, like looking forward to the birth of a child and finding that he is severely retarded and will be severely retarded and a quadriplegic for life, like having an accident and losing your legs. There are tons of things that happen all the time that you wish didn't happen. But if you have a choice, basically. You can accept them as divine providence, and or you can blame God for them and complain to God, why did he let that happen? And basically blame him that, he shouldn't have let that happen. He let you down. And the point of my friend's experience was she realized that I was always wrong, and that in his presence, we will realize that everything was the right thing for him to do, for us. Now, if you want to believe in divine providence, and you'd better believe in divine providence, you have a problem, which is the apparent contradiction between divine providence and free will. That is, if some drunk driver runs me over crossing the street and I lose my legs as a result, that was a drunk driver. That wasn't God. And that drunk driver had free will, and he didn't have to take the 6th drink that night or whatever. And so how is that divine providence? How is the free will of that guy to get drunk and speed through town? It looks like, we know we're not all puppets. It looks like the choice is either everyone is a puppet and God is pulling the marionette strings, or we have free will. And divine providence would seem to imply that we're all puppets and God's, pulling the marionette strings. Looks like a contradiction. I have 2 things to say to that. One is, well, the first, I will get into ways around the paradox. But first, let me say, you think it's a contradiction? Too bad. Because the first mistake you're making is thinking that we can understand these things. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a very, even in some sense, like a very Catholic thing to say. It's an extremely Catholic thing to say, but it doesn't sound like it, because we know as Catholics that faith and reason can't contradict each other, and that there's one truth, and that truth is reflected in both faith, in the teachings of the faith, and also in our intellect, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that our intellect is capable of understanding everything. Okay? There are even things, now this is not gonna be in the bailiwick of most of you, but does anyone out there know the dual slit experiment for photons, for light? It's very, very mysterious. Depending on how you look at it, a photon, which is, you could think of as the smallest unit of light, acts like a particle and not like a wave. And in another circumstance, it acts like a wave and not like a particle. And there is no resolution, let's say, there's no way of understanding the apparent contradiction between how photons behave, depending on whether you look at them or not, is actually what determines how they behave. There's no way to make it make sense in our intellect, okay? But it is true. Time slows down. Time slows down as you approach the speed of light. That's not something that makes sense. That's not something that we can see how it works or even what it means in some sense in our intellect. But it's true, or at least it's observed to be true. How much more when we're talking about how God relates to the created world, to the created universe. We really think that we are in a position that we have to understand the apparent contradiction between free will and divine providence before we accept it. That is suicide. That's spiritual suicide. Okay, I should, in some sense, end there. I think that's actually the healthiest and solidest resolution of the contradiction, is basically, you don't understand? Too bad. Too bad. You're in the position of Job, We're not going to understand. Now, this gets me to another related thing. See, we're saying, no, this can't be true. there's no way for us to have free will and yet for everything to be divine providence. It can't be true. But quantum mechanics is true, even though there's still no way it can be true. We're essentially giving quantum mechanics more credit than we give God. God invented quantum mechanics, or he generated quantum mechanics. I would actually go so far as to say, as when I was praying about this morning, I was thinking, God gave us quantum mechanics to show us that we're not in a position to understand reality fully. So, okay. Seriously, if we can't even understand the physical universe, how are we going to understand the relationship between the physical universe and God? Which gets me to something else. Two more topics, or two more issues here. One is, one way, and this is now this is just a simile, so to speak. So don't use this to really try to understand, so to speak. But think of a novelist writing a story. Now, I know that characters in stories do not have free will. But when a novelist writes a story, it's fiction, and he can do, or he or she can do absolutely anything he wants with the world that he's describing. Think of God, or I shouldn't say think of God, but I think of God as a little bit in that position. God creates the world without any constraints. That doesn't mean that anything can be illogical or a contradiction or something like that, which is what they believe in Islam. But it's without any, in another way, it's without any constraints. Maybe that wasn't a good thing to bring up, but it's something that I sometimes think about. I'll drop that for now. I'll drop that period because it doesn't seem very healthy. Now let me get down to reality. What is reality? We are trapped in this physical world until we die. You know, this table is real and solid. You know, this laptop is real and solid. This glass is real and solid, and all of that stuff. That's not going to change. It's absolutely concrete reality, but it isn't. It's only reality within the frame of reference of the physical world that we're trapped in. And we know this for two reasons. One is that the entire physical world will end someday. Okay? And yet, as Jesus said, the heavens and the earth will pass away, but my word will not pass away. The heavens and the earth will pass away. They are not they're not the ground of reality. They are only the ground of this frame of reality that we're trapped in. And we also know it because we are going to live forever. Now, forever doesn't even exist in the reality that we're trapped in, right? The concept of forever doesn't even exist. We are actually going to exist forever. We're going to exist outside of time. God exists outside of time. You know, clearly what we think of as reality is a little stage in a way, or it's a little playpen or something. And the reality extends, you know, far, far, far. I mean, the ultimate reality is very different from the reality that we're trapped in, I guess, is the safest way to put it. Now, occasionally people get glimpses of outside of the reality we're trapped in. But they're in a lot of trouble if they try to talk about them or write about them, because there is no way to communicate stuff that's outside of the reality we're trapped in. There are no words for it. And there are not only no words for it, there are no mental concepts for it. And this has two implications. One of the implications is that when they do that, many of them, they are doomed. Everything they say is doomed to be misinterpreted or misunderstood. Now, my wife is a philosophy professor. Excuse me for saying this. I know a lot of philosophy professors. They're philosophy professors who are experts in philosophers and in areas of philosophy. Um, Heidegger, perhaps, or a certain phase of Kant, versions of idealism. I suspect Ed is probably the only person who's following me right now. But anyway, the philosophy of branches, or rather philosophers who try to deal with the limits of the reality as we experience reality. And I know philosophers, long-term PhD professors of philosophy who are experts in one of these philosophers and are 100% clueless. They haven't the foggiest idea of what that philosopher is trying to communicate, but that doesn't stop them from writing, published paper after published paper and confusing generations of students. Okay? And the analogy of this is the best analogy that Plato does a pretty good job, by the way. The story of Plato's cave, I think, is about this. But the analogy that occurs to me is, imagine a world in which everyone is deaf, just deaf. There's no sound. They don't hear sound. But you hear sound. And you're trying to describe music to them. Or you're just trying to, say something about music. Good luck. Good luck. There's absolutely nothing. There's absolutely no way you can communicate the concept of music in a world where everyone is deaf. Period. It's hopeless. And if you do try to put into words the experience of music in a world where everyone else is deaf, they're going to misunderstand it terribly. They're all going to think they understand you, or some of them, the ones who decide to get PhDs in you, and they're going to be completely clueless. And they're going to be schools of interpretation that develop over the generations of what, Heidegger or whoever you were meant by this, or what he was saying. And there'll be arguments, and there'll be whole, as I say, schools of interpretation. And it's all nonsense. It's worse than nonsense. The offensive part is that these people don't say, would not say, I have no idea what he's talking about. They would, they would get doctorates in what he's talking about. So anyway, now why am I going through all that? I'm going through all that because I actually think that some of those out there philosophers who dealt with the nature of reality, that dealt with the nature of being, were actually trying to do this. That doesn't mean that getting a doctorate in them is going to do you any good, because, as I said, because it just is not. There's no way to communicate it to somebody who doesn't see it. And again, I think Plato did a darn good job, as good a job as anyone has done since. And so let's see. Okay, now back to Divine Providence and what this person saw in this experience of being before God in the judgment. Every cross. Life is a string of crosses, right? And that's one reason I love the Dolindo meditations. Every cross is designed to push us in the right direction. To push us in the right direction. Okay? And most of us get pushed in the right direction willy-nilly. I mean, basically, whether we like it or not, and we don't like it. And I can give many examples of that. And, okay, first of all, let me back up one step before I forget what I wanted to say, which is a couple of days ago on the conversion of St. Paul, You remember Jesus said to St. Paul, it's hard to kick against the goad. It's hard to kick against the goad. What's that mean? Well, you know what a goad is, right? If you have a cow and you want to move the cow, cows, may be rather large and bulky and lazy and stubborn. You goad it, you push it with a stick, and you keep poking it with a stick to get it to go in the direction you want. And maybe the cow will go in the direction you want, and maybe instead it'll try to kick against the goad and get this stick, kick this stick away so it's not being poked in the rear end by this stick. That's kicking against the goad. Now, when God sends us crosses, we have a choice. We can allow ourselves to be pushed in the direction that cross is pushing us in, or we can kick against the goad and try to undo it, try to resist it. And it's hard to kick against the goad. I mean, it doesn't work in the long run. You waste a lot of effort. You actually, alienate yourself from God, but that's another issue. But it's just basically a lot of wasted effort. God knows what he's doing, and we're much better off going in the direction that he's pushing us. I have a friend. This is a she, and I won't mention her. I wish she was watching the show, but I'm pretty sure she isn't. She's a friend from my past, long in my past. And she has a son who was born severely retarded and quadriplegic. Okay. That son, assuming he's still living, he was alive the last time I saw my friend. He was at the time probably about 35. He had the mental ability probably in some ways, I hate to say it, of a 2-year-old. I mean, there wasn't anything resembling speech that came from him, just grunts. He smiled. Things made him happy. Things made him unhappy. That was visible. But other than that, he was in a wheelchair. He didn't have use of his hands either. He was a quadriplegic. Needless to say, he was in diapers. He had to be fed, spoon-fed essentially. He had to be changed. He had to be lifted out of his wheelchair, into bed, and lifted out of bed into the wheelchair, and bathed and everything. For, at the time, it would have been probably about 40 years. I don't remember how old he was at the time. He was at least 35, so I'll say for 35 years. When he was born to this wonderful Catholic woman, the doctor said, basically, you should put him in a home and get on with your life. Put him in an institution and get on with your life. And her response was, what do you mean? This is my life. And taking care of this extremely crippled and retarded young man now made her a saint. Made her a saint. She was pretty good beforehand, obviously, because she wanted to take care of him. But and he's alive. Well, I have been out of touch with her for 5 years, but he lived until the last time I saw her, and guaranteed if he was in an institution, he would have lived a few years. But basically, it made a saint out of the rest of the family, or made saints out of the rest of the family. Her husband, she had 2 or 3 older children who were normal, and so forth. So, that's an example of a goad that you can go with, and you get the fruit that God planned to come from it, which is the best thing in the world. It's sanctity, it's eternal life, it's more intimacy with God in heaven for all eternity. Or you can kick against the goad, put him in an institution, and not become the saint that God had planned you to be. So let me see if there was anything else in my notes. No, that's pretty much it, actually. I'm glad that I kind of flowed because on my notes it's, point one, point two, point three, point four. I'll finally say that theology, the classic definition of theology, is faith seeking understanding. There's nothing wrong with seeking understanding of things that you don't understand. But there's something very wrong about putting God in the dock and saying, I won't believe it until I understand it. Okay? And I was listening because of the goodbye, people who are leaving, please come back later and watch the end of the show. I was because of this COVID business, I was watching a very good video on I don't know how to put it, but one of the doctors that are generally banned from YouTube, if you know what I mean, and a guest who was also a PhD microbiologist talking about the immune system. Now, this is just our immune system. We have tons of systems in us, right? We have the digestive system, we have the nerve system, we have the muscle system, we have all this stuff. We have the circulatory system, we have blood, we have oxygen, we have lungs, we have all this stuff. This was just the immune system. It was just how your body reacts to alien invaders, viruses and bacteria or whatever. Unbelievably complex. More complicated than New York City. Seriously. Hundreds of chemical reactions, hundreds of different kinds of cells and different kinds of reactions and different missions that different things go on, and triggers that start things happening and triggers that stop things from happening, and ways of isolating the foreign invader, and ways of expelling the invader, and ways of telling whether they're friend or foe. And I mean, I don't know any of this, so I can't even put it into words. But the immune system itself is definitely more complicated than the space shuttle. It's more complicated, than a Boeing 767 by orders of magnitude. It's more complicated, has more moving parts than the world's largest battleship, or the world's largest aircraft carrier, including all of the planes on it. That's just the immune system. Sorry. We would, if we had, we're so incapable of understanding. I mean, I don't know how to put it. What God has done, what God is doing continually, what God has done in designing us, what God has done in designing a no-see-um. Okay, think about a no-see-um or a mosquito or something, right? They must have immune systems. They have navigation systems. They have digestive systems. They have nervous systems, vision systems. No, I mean, there isn't anything in this world pretty much that comes from God that we are in a position to really understand. All of it is so far beyond us. When I was first converted, no, I mean, we're not even capable of understanding literally the simplest living cell. And we're saying that, God, if I'm going to believe you're in charge of my life, I have to understand the apparent contradiction between free will and divine providence. It's just stupid, 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 stupid. We can pray for increasing understanding, and we'll get it. But anyway, that's my that's my homily for today. But I really think this is the Rosetta Stone, so to speak. This is the central key. That's also, it's reflected, of course, in the Divine Mercy, revelations to Saint Faustina, Jesus, I trust in you is at the heart of everything. It's in Dolindo, in the Surrender Novena. Really, really. If you want to get through life, please try to digest this. So with that, I think I'm going to go.